Hello, you silly goobers. Welcome back to the only YouTube channel on the internet. I hope you're doing well. As for me, I have a problem. I've been suffering the past few months, suffering greatly from an addiction to the Suneater series by Christopher. If you clicked on this video, you know what I'm talking about. The Suneater series by Christopher Racchio is the topic of today's video. I am addicted to it. It is somewhat of a problem because I literally can't think about anything else. I am thinking about this series when I'm trying to sleep. I'm thinking about this series when I'm trying to read other books. I'm thinking about this series when I'm taking shits. There's no point in my day where I'm not thinking about it, and it's driving me crazy because I want to enjoy other parts of my life, and I can't anymore. It's taking over everything. This video has been a long time coming. I have wanted to talk about Suneater more in depth for quite a while now, but honestly, I felt like I just couldn't get my thoughts all together to truly express how much I appreciate what is being done with this series, and I don't know if I'm gonna even accomplish that today, but I'm going to try to. So for this video, I'm gonna break it down into a few sections and see if maybe that will help me collect my thoughts, because if I just sit here and yap, I will probably talk for like 2 hours straight, and that would not be an interesting video. That would be nonsense, and it would be all over the place. So I'm going back to my roots. I'm going back to high school English, and I'm breaking this down into 3 body paragraphs and a conclusion after this introduction. And maybe that'll help me. I don't know. For anyone who is not informed on what the Suneater series is, it is a science fantasy series written by my man, Christopher Racchio. It's kind of blowing up lately. If you're on BookTube, especially within this realm of fantasy and science fiction, you've probably heard about it at this point. It is hitting sort of the mainstream of that niche more and more, but it's not necessarily reached the heights of its popularity yet, and that is why I am championing it at every turn. If you follow me on TikTok, which is where I think probably most of you know me from, I have been talking about it nonstop, and now I'm invading this space too. The premise of this series is that it's following the main character, Hadrian Marlowe, who in the first paragraph of the series tells us that he blew up a sun and murdered billions of people, and this is his story of like how he got to that point, which is a bold story to tell, because right from the beginning you're kind of inclined to not like this guy because he's gonna murder billions of people, and you're like, how are you gonna make me empathize with this guy, But if you're like me, absolutely you will end up empathizing with him, and actually the first section of this video is going to be entirely dedicated to our protagonist, Hadrian Marlowe, and my thoughts and feelings on him. Also, before I get into all of this will be spoiler free. I don't know if I should have mentioned that earlier, but I am not going to have any spoilers in this. Maybe in the second section I might touch on some aspects of the world building and the universe that are a little bit spoilery, but they're nothing that's like really affecting the main story or are going to change your reading experience. I'm just going to reveal some of my favorite details that are expressed very, very early on in this series, so no spoilers in general. So without further ado, this is why I think that the Suneater series is so incredible. Alright, let's start by talking about Hadrian, okay? Because he is the crux of this story. He is the nexus of everything that is happening because, in part, he is narrating this story. He is the one who is telling us everything that happens. And so this entire story, we are seeing it through his eyes, and it's through his biases, through his lens, that we are experiencing all of the major events of this story. And I know for a lot of people that would turn them off to it, especially for something that is this epic, but when you have a compelling main character like this, for me at least, I don't mind that I'm seeing everything through his eyes because I find his perspective to be fascinating. And before I get into him as a character, an aspect of this story that I want to touch on that I think is also super important is that because this story is being told by Hadrian, I don't think that the author Christopher Racchio has forgotten that aspect of the story for even a single line. This entire series feels like it truly is Hadrian that is narrating it. It truly feels like this man is sitting down and writing everything that's ever happened to him, and I really appreciate that aspect of the story. I don't think it's ever lost in the sauce. I don't think it's ever lost in translation, and I really appreciate that. That's something that I didn't think I was going to love at the beginning of this story, but I have come to truly love Hadrian's voice, and that's the first thing I want to touch on, which is how Hadrian comes across as the author. Hadrian is extremely melodramatic, like very, very, very melodramatic, and he is self-aware. He comments on this in his own writing, and he's also extremely verbose. There are times where he's describing things, and I'm like, dude, you could have spent like a paragraph on this, and you took like a whole page. And I know some people that annoys them. I actually really love that because it shows you what Hadrian cares about, what he is interested in as a person. So sometimes when he's describing something and he's going on, and it gives me a very vivid picture, and it also makes me think, okay, to Hadrian, this is super important, or maybe this will be super important, so he's taking painstaking efforts to really show it to you, to really immerse you into the image of what he was seeing at that time, and I have come to appreciate that a lot. I will say, early on in Empire of Silence, which is the first book, I found Hadrian to be extremely annoying. I think that's a very universal experience. He is a noble-born son. At the beginning of this story, he comes off as this like mashup of Paul Atreides and Anakin Skywalker, which I think is an apt comparison to make for this character, especially early on in his story. But the way that he grows and changes over this story, believe me, if you find him annoying at the beginning, I think that you will have a very different relationship with him, even by the end of like the second book, or even the first book, honestly. Because the Hadrian that is present at the beginning of this story, and the Hadrian that is present now, where we are in the story, which is the end of book 6, there's still one more book to go, could not be more different as people. His growth over the course of this story is genuinely jaw-dropping. I feel like there are very few characters that I have read, at least, that have undergone such drastic change, not just in the way that they act, in the way they behave, but in the way that they see the world, and the way they see the universe, the things that they believe at the core of who they are, just could not be any more different. And I think that aids the story a lot, because this is a story that's taking place over the course of centuries and centuries and centuries, because in this universe, noble-born people essentially live way longer than like normal people like you or me. Again, not a spoiler, that's something you'll learn in like the first couple of chapters of this series. And I think that the changes that Hadrian undergoes, not only because he experiences things that change him drastically as a person, but also just because time changes people. You know, when you've lived hundreds of years, you're bound to be a different person than you were hundreds of years in the past. I feel like it works super well because Christopher Rocchio takes pains to show us exactly how much Hadrian has changed, and that's something I really appreciate because I enjoy when characters undergo drastic change. It's not always necessary for a story, but for this story especially, that change is necessary. Otherwise, Hadrian's voice would become stale, Hadrian as a character would become stale, but it never does, because Hadrian, every single book, I feel like there's like a new version of him, a new era of who he is as a person that feels realistic and that feels like it builds upon the events of the prior book. Now, getting to Hadrian within the wider context of this story, he is a figure that is extremely polarizing. He tells you this at the very beginning of the story. He says, some people love me, some people hate me. My story is going to kind of force you to make your own opinion about the kind of person that I am, and he himself is very unsure about how he feels about his role in history. He's always expressing, you know, was I right to do this? Was I wrong to do this? And I love the way that Christopher Rocchio has explored this within the series itself, because throughout this series, again, without spoiling anything specific, the way that Hadrian is perceived by other people is extremely polarizing, not just towards the end of the series, but from pretty much the very beginning. The opinions that people have about him and the way that they treat him is just so different depending on what their personal background is, what kind of experiences they've had interacting with Hadrian. And so it makes all of these side characters feel like they have their own depth because of the way that they treat Hadrian and the way that they interact with him. And it also just frames him as such an interesting character where in this society, so many different people can have so many different viewpoints on who he is as a person. And I really haven't seen that done very often. He is in a lot of ways like a storybook hero the further and further you get into this series, and I find it fascinating to see that kind of person from their own perspective. And the last thing I want to touch on with Hadrian specifically is the grandness of who he is as a person, not just because of the events that he is a part of and the role that he plays in those events, but also because of the way that he behaves. He just feels things so strongly. He loves so deeply. He hates so deeply. He just feels everything cranked to 100 100 all the time. And it makes him, to me, very compelling as an author, because sometimes I won't necessarily click with something, but then he'll explain to you, hey, this was super important to me, and this is why it was important to me, and I don't expect you as the reader to fully understand that, but this is why I cared about it. And I love when he does that. Sometimes he addresses the reader directly, and he'll say stuff like this, and I love it when he does that, because it makes him feel so much more real as a person. And it adds this extra element of when he makes certain actions, you understand that his emotions are just flaring so hard, because he does feel everything extremely deeply all the time. Anyways, I love Hadrian. I think his development is incredible, his voice is incredible, and the way that this character has changed over time is just breathtaking. But that's enough about Hadrian. Next, I want to talk about the universe in general, the world building, if you will, because this universe is absolutely massive, and it does pull from other works. You can see influences from Dune, from Star Wars, from Warhammer, all sorts of stuff. Those elements are sprinkled in there, and they add flavor to this universe, but I truly feel like Christopher Rocchio has created his own gargantuan universe that feels so enormous when you're exploring it. There are so many factions and races and planets and theologies and all sorts of explorations about humanity itself that just branch off into all these fascinating directions, because what Christopher Rocchio is focused on, in my opinion, for the most part in this series, is the development of humanity from its earliest days to where we are in this series, which is about 20,000 years in the future, I believe. And seeing just how would civilization evolve as we expand through the cosmos. What would we bring with us? What would be left behind? What parts of humanity would move forward into the future? And I think he's done an amazing job at exploring that and making it feel large enough and making that exploration feel deep enough that I don't think it's ever cheapened. I don't think it's a thin exploration of that. There is so much depth to explore, and he does really dive into the history. I feel like I have a very complex and intricate history that follows humanity from its beginning all the way to where we are now, and even beyond that. There's so much more to this series beyond the surface level world building of the current events of the book. There is a rich history there, and a lot of it contributes to understanding why certain factions believe the way that things they believe, and why the systems of this empire work the way they do because of the way that we expanded into the cosmos. I don't want to say too much more about this for the sake of spoilers, but there's this amazing blend of like real mythology mixed with the mythology of this series. So sometimes there will be references to like Greek mythology, but then it blends together with like the mythology that has come in the next 20,000 years, things that have not happened yet, that have been mythologized. Mythologized? Is that the word? I don't know what word I'm looking for there. You know what word I'm trying to say, right? And aside from that even, there's references sometimes to real religions that exist in modern day Earth, and then there's whole entire new religions that have developed over time, and just seeing how those things blend together. Man, I don't know how he managed to do it without it ever feeling forced, but it genuinely feels like all of this world building is just so organic and might be a representation of how we would develop in the future, although this is very much in that science fantasy realm. A lot of the things that are happening in this series are, in my opinion, extremely unrealistic, but you know, he's kind of pushing the boundaries of what science could potentially do in theory, and I don't know if any of that stuff is actually possible. I'm not a science nerd, but I think Christopher Rocchio is, and I think he's really walking the line of what could potentially be possible. I'm trying to cut myself short here. I really want to keep rambling, but I'm already sitting at like 20 minutes, and that's how long I wanted this entire video to be, so I'm gonna cut it short right here and say just one more thing about the world building, and that's that, in my opinion, at least this is how I interpret it, I think Christopher Rocchio wants you to engage with the ideas that are being presented. He's exploring a lot of things that are very controversial. There are references to like AI, there's references to eugenics, there's all sorts of stuff that exists within this universe that has become either normalized or demonized, and I think Christopher Rocchio wants you as a reader to engage with that and to not just accept all of the things that characters are totally okay with as just being like, yeah, you know what, that's fine, because, spoiler, this is a small spoiler, the empire that Hadrian exists within is like totally cool with eugenics, like, and Hadrian himself doesn't seem to really care either, and it's like, hey, well, that's maybe maybe a little bit fucked up, you know? I don't know if that's like something we should just be okay with, but this empire certainly is, and I don't think that you're supposed to just like blindly be like, you know what? I think they're right. I think this is totally cool. Okay, let's get into this last section now before I talk myself in a circle. Last thing I want to talk about, and this will be the shortest section, is the style with which Suneater is written. Suneater is extremely epic. It is extremely cinematic. There is so much rule of cool going on in this series constantly. It is so just on this level of grandness that I have rarely read in my entire life. And I think this is accomplished because Christopher takes his time building up to epic moments. There is a slow burn aspect to this series, which I think he handles extremely well, because even in those slow burn parts, there's a lot of moving parts, a lot of mechanics that are kind of going on in the background, a lot of things that Hadrian is needing to engage with, even when he's not necessarily in the middle of like a super intense conflict. And because of that, I feel like he's able to bring all these threads together in ways that you really can't accomplish when you're constantly balls to the wall. An example I would use of this, and this is a series that I get asked to compare to a lot when I'm talking about Suneater, which is Red Rising. And it's a series, I like Red Rising, I'm not dissing on it right now, but I'm saying what it accomplishes in that series is a lot different, because Red Rising is much faster paced. Red Rising, something is constantly happening, there's constantly a conflict, there's always something page after page after page. That's sort of the whole draw of it, right? Is that intensity. Suneater has much more epic moments, for me at least, but they wouldn't be possible if it wasn't having this slow burn aspect where you're really getting to dig into Hadrian's psychology as he ages throughout the years and as he experiences his events. Christopher really takes the time to show you how those events would affect a person emotionally. And because of that, there's this weight to everything that happens, because you know that if Hadrian is traumatized by something, he's not just bouncing back from that, you know? He's not just going to recover and be totally fine. That's going to affect him for the rest of his life. He's going to constantly be thinking about it and worrying about it. Sometimes he just can't ever really get past some of the losses he goes through. And I think lending that weight to the slow burn of this series makes everything feel that much larger and that much more important to me as a reader. One of my biggest pet peeves as a reader is when a character goes through something very traumatic or very intense, and then they come out the other side and nothing has really changed about them. They're pretty much just exactly the same person. That's not something I really enjoy as a reader. And Suneater absolutely does not fall into that category. Everything Hadrian goes through affects him deeply, and I really appreciate that about the series. It's not always needed in every series. I want to make that clear. Sometimes it's okay to have a character that just like bounces back and is okay. Like, for instance, I'm a huge One Piece fan. Luffy has gone through some shit and just come back out the other side, pretty much exactly the same guy that he was before. He grows and changes, but also he keeps his happy-go-lucky spirit. But that works for that story because thematically that just makes sense. But for something like Suneater, I would not enjoy it nearly as much if Hadrian was going through these things and then just coming out the other side and he's like, yeah, I'm still just exactly the same dude. I'm totally fine. Nothing about this really affected me psychologically or any of those other things, you know? So that style of writing where we're really taking the time to dig into the effects of these events and where we're really taking time to build up to the bombastic climaxes is something I really appreciate as a reader, and I think that this series does it maybe better than any other series I've ever read, actually. Okay, so I'm already sitting here at 30 minutes of footage, and I told myself this wasn't going to go over half an hour, so I'm going to end it here. These are the things that I think were most important to me as a reader as I've been going through this series. I don't know if I'm adequately getting all my thoughts across. Maybe I'll do like a spoiler version of this where I can truly dig into everything I've been feeling as I've been reading this series, but for now, I think this captures most of it. Man, I didn't even get to like the side characters or the action, or there's so many other things I could have touched on here that I feel like I'm just leaving out, but this video would be far too long if I was doing all of that. So you know what? This is good enough for now. This has become one of my favorite series of all time for a reason. There's a reason I haven't stopped talking about it on TikTok for months and months now. It's just so amazing on every level. This is my taste done to essentially perfection. I have almost no complaints about this series. A lot of things that I would generally kind of levy as a complaint at another series, I'm willing to just let go because I love it so much. It genuinely is super hard for me to be objective about this series right now, especially because I'm still reading it. I'm like halfway through Disquiet Gods right now, which is book 6, and I'm so in there still. It's really hard for me to be objective. So when people ask me to like compare it to other things, I'm like, dude, it's just so much better than all of them because I just don't have any way to be objective about it right now. Anyways, I plan on making this kind of video a series moving forward where I just yap about my favorite series and try to talk about why I love them so much, because to be honest, that's my favorite part about making videos. So I think that's what I'm going to focus on in terms of video making, on top of just talking about what I'm reading and whatnot. But if you like this video, let me know what other series you would like me to talk about. I could do a One Piece one, I could do a First Law one, I could do the Stormlight Archive. I've got so many videos I could make talking about why I love series, and I think that's something I'm going to focus on moving forward, which I am now repeating myself. Anyways, until next time, folks, I hope you're happy and healthy, I hope you're doing well, and I will see you then. Bye-bye!